I bought an old house at auction for $100. When I was renovating, I discovered a secret room in the wall. Behind it was $3 million in cash and a sealed envelope. When I opened it, I saw one word. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me how I ended up buying a house for $100. The answer was simple, and it wasn't glamorous. I was broke, I was desperate, and I had nothing left to lose. My name is Rachel Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and 2 years ago, I was living in a studio apartment in Columbus, Ohio, sleeping on a mattress I'd bought secondhand from a Facebook listing, eating peanut butter out of the jar because it was cheaper than making sandwiches. I'd spent 6 years building a small interior design business with my college roommate, Dana Whitfield, and when Dana quietly dissolved our LLC and walked away with our client list, our vendor relationships, and our reputation, she left me with nothing but a non-compete clause that she'd had her lawyer draft the week before she pulled the plug. I didn't have the money to fight it, so I didn't. My mother kept telling me to move back to Dayton. My sister kept sending me job listings for administrative assistant positions. I kept telling them I was fine. I was not fine. The tax lien auction was something I stumbled onto through a YouTube rabbit hole at 2 a.m. Municipalities sell properties when the owners stop paying taxes. Some of those properties are worth buying. Most are not. But the entry cost could be shockingly low if you were willing to take on something truly unwanted. A house with liens, structural problems, title complications, or a history that made other bidders walk away. The property at 414 Dunmore Street in Millhaven, a small town 40 minutes outside Columbus, had all of those things. 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow built in 1931, last occupied in 2019 when the owner, a man named Gerald Foss, had died without a will and without heirs anyone could locate. The county had been sitting on it for 2 years. The minimum bid was $100, and on the morning of the auction, I was the only bidder. I drove out to see it that same afternoon. It was October, and the maples along Dunmore Street were burning orange and red, which was the only beautiful thing I could say about the situation. The house itself was a disaster. The porch railing had rotted clean through. One of the front windows was boarded over with plywood that had started to warp. The yard was a tangle of dead weeds and volunteer sumac that had grown shoulder-high against the foundation. But the bones were good. I could see it the way you can see potential in a person who's been through something hard. The roof line was straight. The chimney was intact. The porch columns were original and solid. I walked through every room with a flashlight and a notepad, and by the time I came back outside into the cold October air, I had already decided I would fix it myself. I had done enough renovation work through the business to know what I was doing. I would live in it while I worked. I would sell it when it was done. The first weeks were exactly what I expected: exhausting, dirty, and deeply unglamorous. I tore out the bathroom tile and discovered soft subfloor. I pulled the kitchen cabinets and found a layer of wallpaper under the drywall, and under that, original beadboard in near-perfect condition. I replaced the porch railing, reglazed 2 windows, and spent an entire weekend cleaning a century's worth of debris from the basement. It was in the 3rd week that I first noticed something was off. I was working on the dining room wall, the long interior wall that ran parallel to the hallway, when I tapped it with my knuckle the way I always do, testing for hollow spots that might indicate water damage or a failing stud. The left side of the wall sounded the way it was supposed to. The right side did too. But there was a section in the middle, roughly 4 feet wide, that sounded different. Not hollow exactly, more like there was something behind it, something insulated, something that had been deliberately packed in. I told myself it was probably just extra insulation added at some point. Old houses were full of quirks. People did strange things to old houses. I told myself that for 3 more days. Then I got out my stud finder, ran it slowly across that section of wall, and watched the readings jump in a way that didn't match insulation. It matched density. Solid, even density, broken up by a seam approximately 6 feet tall and 2 feet wide on the left side. A door-shaped seam. I went back to my truck and sat in the cold for a long time, looking at the house through the windshield. The maple in the front yard had dropped most of its leaves by then. They were plastered wet against the porch steps. What was behind that wall? Part of me didn't want to know. That's the honest answer. Because some part of me understood. In that particular way, your gut understands things before your brain does, that whatever was back there was going to change things. And I had already been through so many things changing, but I went back inside. I picked up my pry bar, I found the seam, and I opened the wall. The room behind it was small, maybe 8 feet by 6. It smelled of cedar and something metallic, like old coins. There was a single bare bulb overhead, connected to a wire that ran back into the house's electrical system, which meant someone had wired this deliberately. The floor was concrete, swept clean. And stacked against the far wall, in 12 identical black duffel bags, was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I didn't count it that night. I couldn't. I sat on the floor of that little room with my back against the door frame and my heart going at a pace that wasn't healthy, and I stared at the bags. It was only when I finally made myself stand up, made myself breathe, made myself look around the room again, that I saw the envelope. It was on a small wooden shelf mounted to the right-hand wall at eye level. A plain white envelope sealed with wax, with nothing written on the outside. My name was not on it. There was no name at all. My hands were shaking when I broke the seal. Inside was a single card. On the card, in neat, careful handwriting, was one word: run. I didn't run. I want to be clear about that because in the days that followed, I would ask myself 100 times why I didn't. The answer I always came back to was the same. Running requires knowing what you're running from, and I didn't know anything yet. What I had was a room full of money, a word written on a card, and a house I had legally purchased for $100. Running felt like surrendering something I hadn't even had the chance to understand yet. But I didn't sleep that night either. I locked the wall back up as best I could, pressing the cut section back into place, propping it with a length of 2 by 4. And then I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink and watched the window lighten from black to gray to the cold, flat white of a November morning. I went through everything I knew about Gerald Foss, which was almost nothing. He had died in 2019. He had lived alone in this house for at least the last 20 years. He had no heirs the county could find. That was the complete inventory of facts I possessed about the man whose house I was living in. What I did the next morning was drive to the Mill Haven Public Library. Not the county courthouse, not a lawyer's office. The library. Because I wasn't ready to be official about anything yet. I needed to think before I acted, and thinking required information. The librarian, a small, precise woman named Mrs. Garvey, helped me pull the local newspaper archive without asking a single intrusive question, which I appreciated more than I could say. I spent 4 hours at a microfiche reader going back through 15 years of the Millhaven Courier. Gerald Foss appeared in the paper exactly twice. Once in 2003, in a brief mention in a county planning commission notice about a zoning variance for a property on Route 9, a property listed under a shell company called Foss Land Holdings, and once in 2017 in an obituary for a man named Douglas Crane, who was described as a longtime resident of Millhaven and a former business partner of Gerald Foss. Douglas Crane. I wrote the name down. I also wrote down the name of the attorney listed in the zoning notice, Martin Hale of Hale and Associates, with an address in Grayfield, the county seat. I drove home in the dark and sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. The house looked different to me now, not threatening exactly, but weighted, like a person who is keeping a secret and can't quite hide the fact that they're doing it. The next morning, I counted the money. It took me most of the day. I was careful and methodical about it, the way I am careful and methodical about everything I do when I'm frightened, because precision is the closest thing I know to control. I unzipped each bag and stacked the bills on the kitchen table in denominations and counted each stack twice. When I finished, the total was $3,100,000. I sat with that number for a long time. $3.1 million. In a hidden room, in a house I had bought for $100, from a dead man with no heirs, from a county that had no idea what was inside. Legally, the situation was murky in a way that I understood was going to require very careful navigation. The house was mine. What was inside the house was also, arguably, mine. But that argument depended on where the money came from and how it had gotten there, and whether anyone with a legal claim to it was still alive to make that claim. The envelope said "run," which meant someone had put that money there deliberately, which meant someone had known at some point that someone else might find it, which meant the money had a history, and histories, in my experience, have people attached to them. The question was, who? I knew I needed a lawyer, not the one named Martin Hale. He had a connection to Foss, and I wasn't going near anyone with a prior connection to this house until I understood what I was dealing with. I needed someone outside the county, someone I could trust. I also knew I needed to be careful about what I said and to whom and for how long, because the moment I told anyone, a lawyer, a friend, my mother, anyone, this became real in a way that couldn't be undone, and I needed to be ready for that. So I gave myself 3 days. 3 days to research, to think, and to build a plan before I made a single official move. The plan that took shape was not complicated. It had 3 parts. First, establish a clear legal record of the discovery. Date, location, documented inventory, in a way that protected me and created an unambiguous timeline. Second, research the money's origin well enough to anticipate who might come looking for it and why. Third, consult a lawyer who specialized in found property and estate law outside of this county before I said a word to anyone in an official capacity in Millhaven. What I didn't account for in those 3 quiet days of planning was that someone was already watching the house. I didn't know that yet, but I would. The lawyer I found was named Patricia Okafor. She practiced out of a small firm in Westerville, specializing in estate disputes, probate complications, and what her website called property law for non-standard situations. I like that phrase. My situation was non-standard in ways that I suspected would take a while to fully enumerate. I called her on a Thursday morning from my truck, parked 2 blocks from the house, because I had begun to feel, irrationally, I told myself, that the walls of the house were listening. I told her everything. I told her about the auction, the purchase price, the hidden room, the money, and the envelope with a single word. I spoke for 20 minutes without stopping. When I finished, there was a pause on the other end. "Are you safe?" she asked. That was not the question I expected. "I think so," I said. "Okay," she said. "Don't move the money. Don't tell anyone else. Come see me tomorrow." Patricia Okafor was a compact woman in her late 40s with a reputation, I would later learn, for being the person other lawyers sent cases to when those cases were too complicated or too sensitive for them to want to touch. She listened to me tell the story again in her office, this time taking notes, and at the end she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone doing rapid triage. "Here's what you need to understand," she said. "The legal status of this money is genuinely uncertain. Because you purchased the property through a legitimate tax lien auction, you have a strong argument for ownership of its contents. But if the money was obtained illegally, if it was the proceeds of a crime, that complicates things significantly. The government can make a claim, so can any victims of whatever activity generated it. And if it was just saved, hidden legitimately, then it's almost certainly yours. But you'll need to be able to demonstrate that, or at minimum demonstrate that no one with a valid claim can be identified." She advised me to file a formal report with the county sheriff's office documenting the discovery, and to do it immediately, not because I was legally required to in this precise circumstance, but because creating an official, time-stamped record of the discovery was the single best protection I had. If anyone ever claims you found this money and hid it, you want a paper trail showing you went to the authorities the moment you had a plan. I filed the report that same afternoon at the Millhaven County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took my statement was young and visibly unsure what to do with what I was telling him. He made a phone call, then another. Within an hour, I was sitting across from Sheriff Dale Pruitt, a heavy man in his mid-50s with a measured quality to his attention that I found oddly reassuring. He took the report seriously. He sent a deputy back to the house with me. He documented the room, photographed the bags, and logged the serial numbers on a sample of the bills. And then he said something that stopped the blood in my veins. "You know what's interesting?" he said, standing in the little cedar-smelling room, looking at the stacked bags. "We had a report filed on this address back in 2018. Someone, didn't leave a name, called in a tip that there was a large sum of money being stored here. We followed up, found nothing, closed it out." He paused. "Looks like we missed something." Someone had called in a tip in 2018. A year before Gerald Foss died, which meant that someone, not Foss, not a stranger, but someone who knew, had tried to have the money found, or confiscated, or removed from Foss's possession, and it hadn't worked. Who would do that? I drove home that night with the windows down, even though it was cold, because I needed the air on my face to stay clear-headed. I was still sitting in the driveway when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "We know you found it. Don't do anything stupid." I screenshot it, forwarded it to Patricia, and called Sheriff Pruitt. The next morning, Patricia called me with news. She had a contact at the county recorder's office, and she'd pulled the full chain of title on the Foss Land Holdings Shell Company from the zoning notice I'd found. The company had been registered in 2001, and it had 2 members, Gerald Foss and a man named Raymond Crane, the son of Douglas Crane, the man whose obituary had mentioned Foss as a former business partner. I had my first direct connection. I had my first real piece of evidence, and someone out there knew I had it. There was no going back now. Patricia moved quickly once we had Raymond Crane's name. She filed an emergency injunction the following morning, requesting that the money be held under court supervision pending resolution of the ownership claim, and simultaneously notified the county prosecutor's office of the threatening text message. The prosecutor's office was interested. The text had been sent from a burner phone, which told us something about the person who sent it. They had prepared for this, or something like it. This was not a panicked response. This was someone who had been watching and waiting and had a protocol ready. I spent those days at Patricia's office or at a motel outside Columbus where I was staying, not the house. Patricia had advised me to leave Dunmore Street until we had a better sense of who we were dealing with, and I had agreed without argument. I was not reckless. I was scared, and I was precise. Raymond Crane was 47 years old, a commercial real estate developer based in Grayfield. Patricia's research turned up a civil judgment against him from 2015, a contractor dispute settled out of court, and a pattern of shell company registrations and dissolutions that suggested, to people who knew what they were looking at, someone who was very comfortable with the architecture of obscured ownership. He also had a lawyer. His name was Martin Hale, the same Martin Hale who had appeared in the 2003 zoning notice connected to Foss Land Holdings. The same Martin Hale I had instinctively decided not to contact in the first days after the discovery. My instincts, it turned out, had been good. Patricia laid it out for me one afternoon over coffee in her office conference room. "Our working theory," she said, and I want to be clear this is a theory, is that Foss and Crane ran a business together that generated cash. We don't know the nature of the business yet, but the cash storage suggests something that couldn't be easily deposited. When Crane Sr. died in 2017, Raymond, as heir, would have expected to inherit his father's share of whatever arrangement they had. If Foss stonewalled him, refused to acknowledge the arrangement or hand over any funds, Raymond would have been stuck. You can't file a lawsuit claiming money you can't legally explain. "So he called in the anonymous tip in 2018, I said. "Maybe. Trying to trigger a police seizure, after which he could potentially make a claim as an interested party. But the search didn't find anything. Foss must have sealed the room well. And then Foss died in 2019. The property went into limbo, and Raymond was left waiting for an opportunity. He was waiting to buy it himself. That would be my guess. And then you showed up at the auction." I thought about that for a moment. A man who had been waiting years for a chance to get his hands on that money, watching a stranger walk in and take the house for $100. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered because Patricia had told me to document every contact. The voice on the other end was smooth and deliberate, the voice of a man who chose his words carefully. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "my name is Raymond Crane. I think we should talk." I said nothing. "That money belonged to my father's business partner," he said. "There's a legal agreement, a private agreement, that entitles my family to half. I'm not asking for anything that isn't mine. I'm asking you to be reasonable." "Call my attorney," I said, and I hung up. I forwarded the recording. I had been recording every call since the text to Patricia, and then I sat on the edge of the motel bed and let myself shake for exactly 5 minutes. That was the deal I'd made with myself. 5 minutes of fear and then back to work. Patricia called back within the hour. "He'll escalate," she said. "He has no legitimate legal claim that he can bring into a courtroom without exposing himself, which means he's going to try other methods. Be ready." She was right. 3 days later, I came back to the house to collect more of my tools and found the rear door standing open. Nothing was taken. The hidden room had been resealed under court order, and there was nothing of obvious value left inside. But someone had been through my things, my notes, my files, the folder with my purchase documents. They were looking for something they needed to counter my claim. I called the sheriff. I called Patricia. I photographed everything. Then I drove to a diner on Route 9 and ordered the largest coffee they had because I needed to think. What did Raymond Crane need that he'd risk a breaking and entering for? What did he think I had? The answer came to me slowly, the way answers sometimes do when you're tired and frightened and sitting in a diner booth watching the highway. He needed to know if I had the agreement, the private agreement he'd mentioned on the phone. If it existed, and if I had found it somewhere in that house, it cut both ways. It could support his claim, or it could expose what the business had actually been. I didn't have it, but I now knew to look for it. I took 3 days after that, as I'd promised myself I would when things got hard. I stayed at the motel. I slept. I called my sister. Didn't tell her anything specific, just let her talk to me about ordinary things. I watched old movies on the laptop and ate delivery pizza and let my body and mind recover from the sustained adrenaline of the past weeks. When the 3 days were up, I went back to work. The quiet that followed was not comfortable, but it was useful. Raymond Crane went still. No more calls, no more texts from unknown numbers, no more signs of entry at the house. Patricia had warned me that this kind of stillness was often more deliberate than the noise, that a man like Crane, advised by a lawyer like Hale, would pull back and assess rather than continue pressing when his initial moves hadn't produced results. They were watching. They were calculating. I used the time. I went back to the house on a Monday morning with fresh eyes and a new purpose. I was no longer just renovating. I was searching. Methodically, room by room, in every place a document might have been hidden by a man careful enough to hide $3 million in a wall. I pulled up floor vents. I checked behind electrical plates. I looked under the drawer liners in the built-in kitchen cabinet. I spent an entire morning on the basement, which had a concrete floor and a low ceiling and the particular cold smell of old houses. I found it on a Wednesday afternoon. It was in the attic, folded inside the sleeve of an old vinyl record album. Chet Baker Sings, which had been tucked into a cardboard box with a dozen other albums against the north wall. The document was 4 pages, handwritten, dated 2001, and signed at the bottom by Gerald Foss and Douglas Crane. It was a partnership agreement, and it was specific. The 2 men had operated what they called a cash facilitation service, a phrase that, in the context of everything else, was clearly a description of money laundering. Businesses in the region had paid them to absorb cash generated through unreported transactions and reintroduce it into the legitimate economy through a rotation of shell entities, of which Foss Land Holdings was one. The agreement set out the split, 60% to Foss, 40% to Crane, and included a clause specifying that in the event of either party's death, the arrangement would dissolve and assets would revert to the surviving party, not to heirs. That clause was the critical thing. Raymond Crane had no legal claim under this agreement. His father's share had reverted to Foss when Douglas Crane died in 2017, and with Foss's death in 2019, the arrangement had no surviving party. The money, whatever legal status it carried, had gone with the house. I sat on the attic floor for a long time after reading it. The dust motes moved slowly in the light coming through the vent. Outside, a car went by on Dunmore Street. Was I relieved? Yes. Was I also aware that I was holding a document that described, in meticulous handwriting, a years-long criminal conspiracy? Also yes. I photographed every page. I called Patricia. She was quiet for a moment after I told her what I'd found. Then she said, "Rachel, this is significant. This changes the legal picture substantially. But it also means the prosecutor's office is going to be very interested in this document, and how they respond to it is going to affect your claim to the money." I had understood that. I had been thinking about it all afternoon. "There's a pathway here," Patricia said carefully, "where you cooperate fully with the prosecutor's investigation into the money laundering operation, and in exchange, your claim to the money as a good faith purchaser of the property is treated sympathetically. It's not guaranteed, but it's real." And Raymond Crane? If this document is what you say it is, Raymond Crane has been attempting to recover money that he has no legal right to, from a criminal enterprise that his father participated in. The prosecutor is going to want to talk to him too. I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph. It was too early and too uncertain for triumph. But the specific, grounded calm that comes when you have stopped reacting to a situation and started shaping it. 2 days later, I met with a woman named Claire Dunbar, an assistant district attorney for the county. She was serious and efficient and asked excellent questions. I gave her the partnership agreement, the photographs, the recording of Raymond Crane's call, the documentation of the break-in, and the threatening text. She thanked me and said she'd be in touch. Walking out of the county building into the pale November sunlight, I called my old college friend Margot, who was one of the few people I had told even partial truths to during the previous weeks. She had been asking for updates in the careful way of someone who senses the situation is serious but doesn't want to press. "I need to have dinner with a real human being who knows my face," I said. "When?" she said. "Tonight." She drove up from Columbus and we sat in a restaurant booth for 3 hours, and I told her everything. Not because I needed advice, I had Patricia for that, but because I needed someone who cared about me as a person, not as a client, to know that I was still upright. "You're the most terrifyingly competent person I know," she said. "I'm not terrifyingly competent," I said. "I'm just very, very stubborn." She laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks. It felt like coming up for air. They came to the house on a Saturday morning. I was there. I had moved back in 2 weeks earlier, once Patricia confirmed that the court injunction was holding and the money had been formally transferred to court-supervised escrow. The renovation was continuing. Life, in its mundane way, had reasserted itself alongside the extraordinary. I was still retiling the bathroom, still refinishing the dining room floor, still making decisions about cabinet hardware and light fixtures. Work was the one thing that reliably organized my thinking. The knock at the door came at 9:30. Through the front window, I saw 2 people on the porch. A man I recognized from the photograph Patricia had shown me. Raymond Crane, tall, well-dressed, with the careful composure of someone who had rehearsed this, and a woman I didn't recognize, about 60, with a rigid posture and an expression of practiced concern. I opened the door but did not invite them in. "Ms. Mercer," Raymond said, "I apologize for coming unannounced. This is my aunt, Gloria Crane. She was very close to my father." He paused. "We wanted to come in person to clear the air. We feel there's been a misunderstanding." The woman, Gloria, gave me a look of practiced sorrow. "My brother would be heartbroken to know this had become so adversarial," she said. "He always spoke highly of Gerald. They were partners for years, friends." I said nothing. I had learned that silence in conversations like this was more powerful than any response. The truth is, Raymond continued, his voice modulated to something just short of reasonable, my father put a great deal into that partnership. Years of work. The money in that house was, in significant part, the result of his effort. Legally, I understand the situation is complicated. But morally, he spread his hands in a gesture of appealing openness, surely you can see that the right thing is to come to some arrangement. There it was. Morally. The word people use when they can't use legally. We're not looking for all of it, Gloria said, stepping slightly forward with the air of someone offering a great concession. A third. That's all we'd ask. A quiet, private arrangement. No more legal proceedings. No more stress for either side. You'd keep the house, you'd keep the majority, and we could all move on. I looked at them both for a long moment. Do you know what I do find morally interesting? I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. That you're standing on my porch making this offer the same week your attorney filed a motion to have the partnership agreement excluded from evidence on the grounds of privilege. The rehearsed composure on Raymond's face flickered, just for a second. Those are separate matters, he said. They're not, though, I said. If you genuinely believed you had a moral claim, you'd be making it in court. You're here because you've been advised that you can't make it in court, and I'm not interested in private arrangements that are designed to accomplish what your legal strategy can't. Gloria's sorrow curdled into something sharper. You're making a mistake, she said. Raymond has friends in this county, people who've known this family for decades. You are a stranger here, and strangers who make enemies of the wrong people. Gloria, Raymond said quickly. She stopped, but the mask had slipped, and we all knew it. I think you should leave, I said. Raymond looked at me for a moment with an expression that I recognized, not quite anger, but something underneath anger, something colder. Then he nodded once, and they walked back down the porch steps and got into a silver sedan and drove away. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a minute. My heart was going fast. My hands were steady. I had expected them to come. I had even expected the approach, the aunt, the moral appeal, the supposedly modest ask. What I hadn't fully expected was how transparent it would feel, how clearly I would be able to see the machinery behind it. The fear was still there. Gloria's words, strangers who make enemies of the wrong people, had landed with the weight they were intended to carry. Raymond Crane had connections in Millhaven. I did not. But fear, I had learned over the past months, was not the opposite of resolve. It was more like fuel if you knew how to use it. I felt it now as a kind of clarifying heat. I called Patricia. I told her everything they'd said, and specifically what Gloria had said at the end. Good, Patricia said, in a tone that surprised me with its satisfaction. That's very good for us. It didn't feel good. It will. An implicit threat on your doorstep, with the context of everything else we've documented, is exactly the kind of behavior that tells a prosecutor this is not a family with a sympathetic claim they've been unable to vindicate through proper channels. It's a family that's been applying pressure to someone who got in the way of what they wanted. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard. The sumac was bare now, black sticks against the gray sky. I had cleared most of it back from the foundation. The house was starting to look like itself. How much longer? I asked. Weeks, not months, Patricia said. We're close. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in mid-December, By then, the prosecutor's investigation had been running for 6 weeks, and Patricia had been told, in the careful language that lawyers use when they want to convey a great deal without committing to specifics, that the investigation had been productive. What that meant, concretely, I would learn in stages. What I knew going in, the ADA, Claire Dunbar, had filed a formal criminal referral against Raymond Crane for harassment and witness intimidation, based on the text message, the phone call, and Gloria Crane's statement on my porch. Martin Hale's motion to exclude the partnership agreement had been denied, and a forensic accountant retained by the prosecutor's office had spent 4 weeks tracing the serial numbers on a sample of the bills in the hidden room, cross-referencing them with bank records obtained through subpoenas. Some of the bills trace back to legitimate business transactions. Some of them trace back to sources the forensic accountant's report described, in dry official language, as transactions consistent with structured cash deposits associated with known illegal enterprises. In other words, some of that money was clean enough, and some of it was demonstrably dirty. I sat in the hearing room in a charcoal blazer I had bought secondhand and pressed carefully the night before, and I was calm. Not the performed calm of someone pretending, the actual grounded calm that comes from having done every single thing you could do and being prepared for what came next. Raymond Crane sat on the other side of the room with Martin Hale. He was dressed impeccably. He held his face in the expression of a man who has been wrongly accused of something minor and is patiently waiting for the misunderstanding to resolve itself. I had seen that expression on powerful people before. It was a kind of armor. The hearing was not the final resolution of the ownership question. That would come later, through a separate proceeding. But it was the proceeding at which the criminal referral would be addressed, at which the admissibility of the partnership agreement would be formally affirmed, and at which the overall direction of things would become clear. Claire Dunbar was methodical and precise. She walked the judge through the timeline, the tax lien auction, the discovery, the formal report, the text message, the phone call, the break-in, the discovery of the partnership agreement, the visit from Raymond and Gloria Crane. Then she introduced the forensic accountant's findings, and then she introduced something I hadn't known was coming. She introduced testimony from a man named Frank Sobieski, age 71, a retired restaurant owner from Grayfield who had, under a limited immunity agreement, agreed to describe in detail his participation in the cash facilitation service operated by Gerald Foss and Douglas Crane between 2001 and 2016. Frank Sobieski described payments, procedures, and the specific individuals who had managed his account. He named Douglas Crane as his primary contact. He named Martin Hale as the attorney who had drafted the shell company documents. Martin Hale, sitting at the defense table, went very still. Raymond Crane turned to Hale and said something in a low voice. Hale shook his head almost imperceptibly. Then Dunbar said, "Your Honor, at this time the state would also like to note that a second witness, currently under a separate immunity agreement, has provided corroborating testimony and additionally provided documentation indicating that Raymond Crane was aware of the nature of the cash facilitation service operated by his father no later than 2014, and that he received a direct distribution from the enterprise in 2015 in the amount of $80,000. The composure on Raymond Crane's face did not break, but something behind it did. I watched it happen, a change in the quality of his stillness from controlled to frozen. Hale put his hand on Raymond's arm. The judge asked Raymond's counsel if they wished to respond. Hale stood and said in a voice that was carefully, professionally steady, "Your Honor, my client categorically denies." "Mr. Hale," the judge said, "I'm going to stop you there. Given the testimony we've heard this morning, I am also directing that the Bar Association's Ethics Committee be notified of the potential conflict of interest arising from your firm's role in the creation of the entities described in the partnership agreement and your current representation of Mr. Raymond Crane in matters related to those same entities. Do you understand?" Hale said, "Yes, Your Honor." He sat down. I looked at Raymond Crane. He was looking straight ahead. His jaw was tight. The armor was still on, but it had been dented badly, and we could all see the shape of what was underneath. The months after the hearing moved with the particular deliberate speed of the legal system, which is to say, not fast, but relentlessly. Martin Hale withdrew from Raymond Crane's case within a week of the hearing, citing a conflict of interest. 2 weeks later, the State Bar opened a formal investigation into Hale and Associates. Raymond retained new counsel, an attorney from Cincinnati who came in with an aggressive posture, and Patricia told me, almost immediately began the process of assessing whether any deal was possible. There was no deal. The criminal case against Raymond Crane moved forward on 2 charges: witness intimidation and criminal receiving of proceeds from an illegal enterprise, the $80,000 documented in the 2015 distribution. Frank Sobieski's testimony held. The second immunity witness, whose identity was not disclosed to me, apparently held as well. Raymond's new counsel argued that Raymond hadn't known the nature of his father's business. The documentary evidence that he had received the distribution, combined with Sobieski's testimony that he had personally met Raymond at 2 operational meetings, made that argument very difficult to sustain. In March, Raymond Crane pleaded guilty to 1 count of criminal receiving of proceeds from an illegal enterprise. He received a fine of $200,000 and 18 months of supervised release. He did not go to prison. That part was hard for me to sit with, initially, the sense that the consequence didn't match what he had put me through. But Patricia reminded me that supervised release for a commercial real estate developer was not nothing. It meant public record. It meant professional damage. It meant the loss of the carefully constructed reputation that had been his most valuable asset. The civil proceeding on the money was resolved in May. The determination was layered and required careful reading, but Patricia walked me through it with the patience she had extended to me throughout this entire ordeal. The portion of the money that had been traced to demonstrably illegal sources, approximately $900,000, was subject to civil forfeiture and was transferred to the state. The remaining $2.2 million, which the forensic accountant had been unable to connect to traceable criminal proceeds, was determined to belong to me as the lawful purchaser of the property and its contents, absent any valid claimant withstanding. $2.2 million. I had to read that determination 3 times before it felt real. I called Patricia from the parking lot outside her office and said something completely incoherent, and she laughed. "You earned it," she said, "every bit of it." I sat in the car for a while before driving anywhere. It was May, and the tree in Patricia's office parking lot was fully leafed out, that particular saturated green of early summer, and I watched the light come through it and thought about the past 7 months. The motel room, the diner on Route 9, the attic with the dust motes, the hearing room and Raymond Crane's frozen face. I thought about the envelope on the wooden shelf and the single word inside it: run. Gerald Foss, an old man who had spent years accumulating money through means he must have known would eventually catch up with him, had left a warning for whoever found his secret. He hadn't been able to get out of the situation himself. The money was too woven into who he was, what he'd built, the life he'd chosen. But he'd left a word, a human instinct at the end. Don't let this trap you the way it trapped me. I had not run, but I had not been trapped either. I called my sister from the parking lot. I told her I had something to tell her and that it was a lot and that all of it was okay. Gloria Crane, for her part, was interviewed by investigators and declined to cooperate. She was not charged. The threat she'd made on my porch was serious, but not prosecutable as a standalone criminal act without more. But she had made it in front of me, and I had made a contemporaneous note of the exact words, and those notes were part of the record. What happened to Gloria Crane's life after that was her own business. Raymond Crane's commercial real estate portfolio, I later learned, had been significantly leveraged against ongoing projects that required him to maintain clean credit and a clean record. The conviction and the fine began a cascade. 3 projects lost financing within 6 months. 2 partners withdrew from pending deals. By the end of the year, Crane Development LLC had filed for dissolution. That was not my doing. That was the natural arithmetic of what he had chosen to do and been caught doing. I took no satisfaction in it beyond the cold acknowledgement that consequences, when they come, are rarely limited to the ones the court formally imposes. I finished the renovation of 414 Dunmore Street the following October, almost exactly 1 year after I had first tapped that dining room wall and heard something strange. I did not sell it. I had intended to. That had been the plan from the beginning. Fix it, flip it, move on. But somewhere in the months of working on it, through all of it, the house had become something else. Not just a project, a place. My place. I had stripped it down to its bones and put it back together, and I knew every inch of it in the particular, intimate way you know something you've repaired with your own hands. The dining room wall, replastered and painted a warm ivory, showed no sign of what had once been behind it. The small cedar room was gone. I had opened it up into the dining room, gaining 18 inches of floor space that made the whole room feel different, more generous. I had kept the cedar-smelling wood from the walls and used it to build a small floating shelf in the kitchen, which I found quietly, privately satisfying every time I looked at it. With the settlement money, I did several things. I established a working fund for the business I was rebuilding, interior design and property renovation, operating as Mercer Design, with no partners, no non-compete clause, and no one's name on the LLC but mine. Within a year, I had 4 paying clients. Within 2 years, 12. The reputation I'd lost when Dana Whitfield walked away with our client list had not come back. I had built a different one. I also paid off my mother's mortgage, which was something I had been thinking about doing for 15 years and had never had the means to attempt. She cried when I told her. I cried too. My sister, who had been sending me administrative assistant job listings 2 years earlier, took me out to dinner and said she'd never doubted me for a moment. I let her believe that. Margot, who had driven up from Columbus to sit with me in a restaurant booth and tell me I was terrifyingly competent, became one of my first clients. Her apartment renovation was written up in a regional design publication. It was my first press. I thought about Dana Whitfield sometimes. Not with the searing, contaminating anger I'd carried the first year after she dissolved our partnership, but with a more neutral curiosity. She had taken the client list and the vendor relationships and the reputation and had spent 2 years building those into something new. From what I could see from the outside, a website, an Instagram, occasional industry mentions, it was going adequately. Not badly, not brilliantly. Adequately. I didn't wish her harm, but I also didn't wish her well in any active way. She occupied a compartment in my memory that was sealed and labeled and stored on a high shelf. Once in a while, I was aware it was there. Mostly, I was not. Raymond Crane, by the following spring, had sold his house and moved out of Millhaven County. I don't know where he went. The dissolution of Crane Development, LLC, was a matter of public record. His name came up occasionally in connection with the state investigation into the broader money laundering network. But from what Patricia told me, he was a secondary figure at best. A man who had inherited a connection to something criminal without fully understanding or fully wanting to understand what he was connected to. That didn't excuse what he had done to me, but it gave him a shape I could understand. Martin Hale's law license was suspended for 18 months, pending a full ethics review of his firm's involvement in the shell company structures. Whether he would practice again after that, I didn't know. Patricia Okafor sent me a bottle of champagne when the final civil determination came through, with a card that said simply, "Well done." I kept the card. I still have it. The house on Dunmore Street in October, with the maples turning orange and red on the street outside, looked exactly the way it had looked the first day I drove out to see it, except that now the porch railing was solid and the windows were clear and the yard was clean, and there was a light on inside. I sat on the porch steps one evening that fall with a glass of wine and looked down the street and thought about what it means to start over. Not the romantic version of starting over, the clean slate narrative where you simply leave the bad thing behind and arrive refreshed at the good thing. The real version, which is accumulated, which carries the weight of what came before and is shaped by it and is better for being shaped by it, even when the shaping was painful. I had bought a house for $100. I had found $3 million in a wall. I had been threatened and broken into and lied to and maneuvered against by people with more connections and more money and more to lose than I had, and I was still here. The maple in the front yard still had most of its leaves. They were burning orange and red in the last of the evening light. I stayed on the porch until it got too cold, and then I went inside. Gerald Foss left one word: run. I think he meant more than he wrote. He meant, don't let greed trap you the way it trapped me. I didn't run, but I also didn't let fear make my decisions. I documented everything, trusted the right people, and faced it one step at a time. That's the whole lesson, not bravery, just stubborn, methodical refusal to be pushed around. So tell me, what would you have done? Found $3 million in your wall, a threatening text, a man on your porch. Run? Hide it? Fight? Comment below. I read every one. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe. Thank you for listening.